Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. My name is Lou Perez. If you'd like to support my work, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community. You'll get to listen to my podcasts and watch my sketch comedy videos before I release them to the rest of the world. And you'll also have access to exclusive content for members only. And if you're looking for another way you can support me, you can do so by supporting my sponsors. Black Organic Cold Brew. Just head over to www.blvckbrew.com and use promo code LOU for free shipping. And if you're into CBD products, please check out Paloma Verde CBD. Head over to palomaverdecbd.com and use promo code LOU for 25% off purchases over $75. All right, here we go. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm so happy to be joined by Robert Tracinski. He is the editor of Symposium, as well as the writer, editor, creator of the Tracinski letters. So make sure to check those out. And I've been reading your work, Robert, for quite a while. And I think the first time that I came across you was with you were writing some pieces for the Federalist, and I think that's right. That's where I started, and I know over the years you stopped writing for them. We don't have to get into that, but I highly recommend people check out your work and to follow you on Twitter as well. So that's where I got to say that right off the bat. So,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and
I've been a fan of yours, Lou. I've been a big fan of yours, Lou. Ever since you came to us as Gary, the Trump defender, Gary, Trump's biggest defender.
Oh, that's right.
That was how I first got to know your stuff, and I thought that was because every one of us has, not even on the right. I think just everybody has been Gary at some point, right? The guy who's forced to defend something that he doesn't really agree with, but everybody else is being wrong too. Right. One of the first things I showed up at college in 1987. I was right in the middle, freshman in college, right in the middle of the Bork hearings. This is Robert Bork, who was a Supreme guy nominated to the Supreme Court. He didn't get through, but there are these really contentious hearings that I didn't like Bork. There were things I didn't like about Bork, but I was the anti-Bork guy in the college dorm because it was, so many of the attacks against him were also wrong-headed. So I was Gary for my freshman year of college. So
yeah, and for those of you interested in the video, it's "Stop Making Me Defend Donald Trump." And yeah, and it was wild when we released that video. I didn't have really any hopes for it. I was just like, okay, finally we're able to put this one together and get it out. And then it really started resonating with people that I think are who find themselves in that position where it's like, hey, I don't like the guy, but you don't have to make things up about him. And yeah. it was a similar thing with Obama too, where I used to see that all the time. It's like it's like, instead of talking about making stuff up about Obama, you could just talk about Libya and what happened there. Like
instead of talking about the birth certificate, how about you talk about Billy Ayers and Reverend Wright and these guys got enough skeletons in his closet as it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. And we've all seen that one meme where it's like, worst person in the world is right. It's like, it
makes a good point that you have to, oh God, no, I have to agree with him. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I think it's safe to say that, you and I are similar in being weirdos in that it's sort of like where do we classify ourselves when, I mean, you especially, you've had run-ins with the left. I mean, some of your writing on socialism in particular, that's what really, got me interested in your work. And then, having these contentious, arguments with people on the right. And so how would you describe, where you are in this whole thing?
Right. Yeah. So in the normal political categories, I'm an outlier because I'm an atheist, so I can't be conservative, right. And I'm a pro-free marketer, so I can't be quote unquote liberal or on the left. And although I actually describe myself as liberal, and I want to get into that in a bit, but I'm not really I'd be closest to being a libertarian, but I'm too much of a hawk to be a libertarian. Very specifically, I'm an objectivist. I'm influenced by and agree with the philosophy of Ayn Rand. But that's, this very tiny subcategory that's not one of the wider political categories. I always like to tell people that, so in college, in high school, I was the guy who said, liberal on social issues and conservative on economic issues. More recently, I've been gravitating towards, the classical liberal, later on gravitate to the classical liberal label, which is the idea that, I would be what counted as a liberal in the 19th century and the 18th century, an advocate of freedom in politics and freedom across the board in freedom in your personal life, freedom in your economic life. And I've sort of set out what I'm doing with Symposium magazine, the new publication I've started up, is I'm trying to reclaim the label of liberal, because there's a lot of illiberalism out there on both the left and the right. And I think I'm just sort of advocating the idea that liberals of all stripes, even the conventional sort of center-left liberals and the center-right classical liberals and the libertarians, we should all be sort of gathering together and working together and having conversations together to try to strengthen the cause of freedom, because there is a sort of authoritarian style of politics that's rising up, on both the left and the right, sort of the Bernie bro authoritarians and the Trump authoritarians.
Yeah. And it's one of those things too that I find, especially when it comes to matters of free speech, where there are people that I'm friends with that I have no idea what they think about economics or foreign policy, because all we keep talking about is, oh man, do you hear they're trying to get rid of so-and-so, or can you believe that this book is no longer in print, or can you believe what they're teaching kids nowadays? And it's, and I don't know, I sort of found that if we can agree on the free speech issue, I think we could actually have conversations about the other stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the we can have conversations part is important, because
Right.
that's the fundamentality of free speech as a political issue, and I think also as a cultural issue. I think there is you hear sometimes the culture of free speech, because there's a lot of things that people can do that are perfectly legal. It's perfectly legal for Twitter to block somebody's account because somebody said something Twitter doesn't like. That's perfectly legal, but they should also, there's a moral aspect or a cultural aspect to it, that they shouldn't be doing it arbitrarily. They shouldn't be doing it to arbitrarily shut down. They shouldn't do it without provocation, without some reason or standard or principle behind it, so that they're not just shutting down discussion of important issues. And so, the fundamental basic issue is, can we still talk? Can we still have a debate? Can we still have a discussion? And, the temptation on every side of politics, for as long as I've been involved with it, which is a while now, the temptation is always to win every argument by not having it in the first place. Right. So if you can rule the other guy out of bounds, oh, you're not going to listen to him because of such and such, because this person isn't qualified to speak because they're white, or this person isn't qualified to speak because he's conservative, or this person isn't, if you can, I'm sure there are versions on the other, this person, don't listen to him, he's a never Trumper, or he's a leftist, or he's a liberal, whatever. If you can sort of rule somebody out of bounds from the beginning, before they even open their mouths, you automatically win the argument, because you've convinced your audience not to even listen to the other person. But the thing is that that's the cheap, easy way to win an argument. And it's a good way to perpetuate a lot of errors and a lot of falsehoods and a lot of misunderstandings, and to sort of run us off the rails in the way that I think we see is happening right now.
Yeah, and one of the recent pieces you wrote was in defense of the classics, which I'm 39, and I'm just thinking, like, wait a minute, we have to defend the classics, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that piece, and what inspired it.
Yeah, well, I came into that because I am a classical music guy. I'm I'm even a classical music snob, actually. I'll be upfront about that. There's a line from Tom Lehrer, that the satirist, where he did a thing about folk songs, and he referred once to rock and roll and other children's records. And there's a part of me, I grew up in rock and roll, but there's a part of me that sort of says yeah to that line. And so I'm a classical music guy. I'm a pianist. I do pretty decently on the pianist. I'm a really terrible on the violin. But I'm a lover of classical music, and the shoe I've been waiting to drop for a while is that classical music is racist, and that's just starting to bubble up right now. There's this whole sort of campaign, and it came out. There was a campaign against a German a German Jewish music theorist from the early 20th century. Guy's long dead, but there's this whole campaign to sort of discredit him because he's racist and therefore his theories are racist. And he actually did express some racist views. And it's interesting, he was a Jew in Germany in the early 20th century, and his views were his work was later suppressed, and his family was persecuted by the Nazis. But he himself had this idea that the Germans were the perfect race. So it's a very odd, complicated world we live in. But he had racist views, and they're saying, oh, therefore, this guy's name was Schenker, and therefore all of his theories about music theory need to be thrown out because they're all tainted because he had these bad views on this other issue. And it was done in this sort of ridiculous, overstated way, like, his view on the relations of tones is sullied by.
Yeah, I want to quote that because so you quote Philip Ewell. Is that a Ewell?
Ewell, I think it's
Ewell.
Ewell.
Yeah, Ewell. So the quote is, and I'm shaking my head. For those of you just listening, I hope you can hear me, the wind just going as I shake my head. He writes, as with the inequality of races, Schenker believed in the inequality of tones. Now, I mean, to be frank, what the fuck does that mean?
Well, as I point out, I mean, you could have just as well talked about the inequality of numbers. That 3 is larger than 2, and therefore that's racist. It's a totally, there's no analogy there. There's no connection between those two things. But that's sort of what we do now. Is that everything's tainted by association, and that's what I mean by this thing about how you could win any argument you like as long as you can rule the other side out of bounds to begin with. And race is the favored version right now of doing that, of saying, oh, well, there's some association with racism here. Therefore, what you have to say on economics, what you have to say on science, what you have to say on the environment, whatever topic it is, it's all ruled out of bounds. We don't even have to listen to your arguments or consider you because we've associated you in some way, accurately or inaccurately, with racism. But the attempt here has been made to broadening beyond just this attack on Schenker to say, oh, well, the classical music is just the musical preferences of white Europeans in the late 18th century. There's nothing special about it. Therefore, we shouldn't bother teaching it, and elevating it and saying Beethoven is a genius. This is the specific claim this guy says. To say Beethoven is a genius is racist because you are elevating him above all other types and styles of music. And regarding him as so important, and that is inherently racist. And it goes back, as I mentioned, I'm an objectivist. I come from the sort of the Ayn Rand corner of things, and it reminded me so much of a line that she has. It's actually from her notebooks when she's creating the notes for this character of Ellsworth Toohey in The Fountainhead, and he's this sort of collectivist, socialist intellectual he's after power. He's the power-lusting intellectual who uses ideas as a way to disarm people so we can get power. And he talks about, and her notes on Toohey are that he says he's against Rockefeller and Morgan, and those are the big industrialists of the late 19th century. He says he's against Rockefeller and Morgan, but he's actually against Beethoven and Shakespeare. So the economic issues are just a front for the idea that he's against the idea of any extraordinary individual. And that resonated with, because, here are these people saying you can't say Beethoven's a genius. And you also had, I came up with examples of people saying we shouldn't be teaching Shakespeare in the schools. And it's the idea that if you affirm that these people were great and did great things that are valuable and of enduring value enough that we need to still be studying them today, that's unfair to everybody else. Like I said, the current style of doing that that's popular is to say it's racist. That's unfair to everybody else, and therefore, these people have to be shoved aside in favor of marginalized voices, and we can't affirm the greatness of these great works.
Yeah, and in that piece, I mean, you go into real detail, and stuff that goes over my head because I don't know music theory, and I
tried to sort of explain it in a more everyday way, because I'm not a music. I know people. There are people who know a lot more about music theory than I do. I try to sort of translate it down as best I can to a way that an average person. I do a little sort of breakdown of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
The fifth, yeah, and I think where it really hits is you sort of go through the music and why the music is great, but then also I mean, if you look at the biography of Beethoven, what he was going through as a man
Yeah.
at that time, losing his hearing
Yeah.
and all that, and managing, you know, pushing
Yeah.
through and coming up with something like that. Yeah, the greatness thing is, I mean, to me, it's just so evident that yeah, there are people who are great at things, you know, like for example, like you know, just to take like someone like a Michael Jordan. Like
Right. Right.
I am not the Michael Jordan of anything. There is nothing I do where people are like, wow, Lou's a, you know, Lou's the Jordan of that. And it's interesting. I remember I read Tyler Cowan. I think he had a book about
Yeah.
like a ode to big business or something, and he was explaining CEOs and CEO pay
Hmm.
and how people can understand how LeBron James makes so much money, right? Because he's a great basketball player and people want to come and see him play, but they can't understand how a CEO might, you know, garner the wage, you know, the salary
Yeah. Yeah.
that he or
Yeah.
she does, because what they do is also great on a you know, it's a different field, but it's also great.
Yeah, I think there are a few exceptions to that, like, you know, Steve Jobs. I mean, there are those
Mhm.
examples out there. It's like everybody knows Steve Jobs was this great visionary, did these things that nobody even thought of before. And there you'll find people out there who will say, "Oh, he wasn't so great," you know. But I think most people know that, you know, the things he did, this whole series of incredible innovations that he fostered at Apple. So there are a few of those where it's more visible to the average person because, you know, you've got something in your pocket.
Right.
You have a supercomputer in your pocket and you know that this person helped make that happen. But, you know, so if it's the CEO of Union Carbide, you have no idea what this person does and
Right.
why does he make so much money. Even though you know, it's probably, you know, it's an incredibly complex job. I mean, you know, major chemical company, there's a lot that can go wrong. Or Elon Musk, I think, is sort of the, you know, he has his fanboys out there. Elon Musk drives me a little nuts sometimes because, you know, whenever he says something, it's like there's a 50-50 coin flip that it'll be either really brilliant and visionary or it'll be total flim flam. But but still, you know, the brilliant and visionary stuff is out there. You can see him launching rockets. So, you
Right.
know, people sort of get that. But I think, like I said, you know, a lot of the what CEOs do or a businessman do is behind the scenes and you don't see it. And you don't typically, and a lot of times in the average person watching the media, they only notice the CEO when something goes wrong. Right.
Hmm. Right.
So it's like, okay, you know, this Boeing plane crashed and the CEO stepped down because his planes were crashing. And so, you know, and even that was the recent one from last year or so. And the thing is, the guy, it wasn't his program. He had just recently become CEO. There was no particular reason why he was specifically at fault for this, but he's the guy in charge. He's got to fall on his sword. And so you hear about, oh, the CEO, and so you think, oh, these CEOs are these miscreants. By the way, that's one of the reasons, by the way, that I think you get high CEO pay, because every time a CEO goes out there, he's taking a risk. You know, you become CEO of Boeing, you're taking a risk. If something goes wrong, not only are you going to lose your job, but you may never get another job as CEO ever again, right? Your career is over because you're associated with this big failure, whether it was your fault or not. So that's another reason why you get the CEO. People say, why do CEOs get paid so much even when they're failing? Well, they get paid because there's the risk of failure is huge, right?
Hmm.
So you have to have that compensation of, you know, if something goes wrong that isn't even my fault and I end up getting associated with it, you know, I want to make sure that I have some downside protection on that. And, you know, you're hiring people, if you're hiring a CEO, you're hiring someone who's good at negotiation, right?
Hmm. Oh, right.
If he can't negotiate a good salary, he probably shouldn't be getting the job. But anyway, I think the big thing is it's, you know, it goes back to Bastiat had this, the French economist, Frederick Bastiat, uh, early 19th century, I think one of the great classical economists. And he wrote a book called What is Seen and What is Not Seen.
Hmm.
And the idea is that people tend to judge things based on what they see and not on the stuff that's behind the scenes or that's indirect or that is, you know, the far off consequences because you don't see them. They're off somewhere else. And so his example was, you know, the government taxes people and builds a bridge. And everybody says, oh, wow, look at this bridge. You can see that. You see that they've created this bridge, and that's a great thing. He says, what you don't see is all the other things that would have been done with that money had it been left in the pockets of the people who originally owned it. because you don't see that because it didn't happen. And so you don't see the cost of that bridge. And so you tend to think that everything the government does is sort of free money coming down from heaven. And you don't see where that money's coming from and what might have been lost because that was taken.
Yeah.
And I think something applies here when you talk about business and capitalism, is that a lot of that stuff goes on behind the scenes where people aren't watching it, where the average person doesn't have the ability to grasp it. Whereas, like you said, LeBron James, you can watch it on TV and appreciate the nature of that skill.
Yeah, and bringing it back to the classics. I mean, what do you think? What role has government played in, perhaps diminishing the classics? It's been a while since I've been in school, but it seems like at least with government education, it's sort of going the route of let's get rid of Shakespeare. We don't really need Shakespeare right now. Let's broaden the reading materials to things beyond that.
Well, I also think that even before the sort of modern wokeness, where you're supposed to be, reading other things for the racial reason, the racial politics sort of reasons, even before that, there was a dumbing down that was going on. Because I remember, like I said, I'm a classical music guy. I remember having classes when I was a kid in school, fairly young, where you'd have somebody come in and they play classical music and they talk about it a little bit. Not deep explanations, but we were exposed to it. And I think that has diminished. One of the reasons it diminished was there was sort of the counterculture of the 1960s, where that was seen as snobbish, as elitist, and we don't want to be elitists, right? And this even goes back to, one of the reasons why folk music is associated with the left, is there were leftists who said, well, folk music is written by the people.
Right.
And so therefore it's the people's music, and we have to emphasize that, as opposed to this other stuff, which is done by elites. But then in addition to that, what happened in the 90s is you had this sort of No Child Left Behind and all the standardized testing. And that had, I think we're just dealing with the fact that has a devastating impact on the public schools, because you had so much of the schools are organized around standardized testing that determines the curriculum. And whatever's in the standardized test, that's what you teach to. And one of the things that's sort of gutted is it's gutted some of the arts and literature curriculum, things that are not immediately practical. I also see that happening on the university level, because what happened is, the price of tuition, college tuition, has gone up so much that, you get these people, if you come out with $100,000 in debt, you better not have a degree in literature, English literature, or, some sort of liberal arts degree that doesn't give you any specific skills. You better have an engineering degree or a legal degree or something that's going to, make you qualified to make enough income to pay back those student loans. And that's a result, I think, of a sort of a foolish sort of subsidizing. We subsidize federal loans and we subsidize education to make it cheaper. And the result was it actually got more expensive.
Yeah.
Because there's studies out there that universities gobbled up like 67% of all new student loan money gets gobbled up in extra tuition by the university. And so you could borrow more money to pay for your school, but then it gets more expensive and you're left with all this debt.
Yeah.
And you can't work your way through school the way people used to.
My wife, she's a former dancer and choreographer, and she went to school. She went to University of the Arts in Philadelphia and studied dance. And so when we started dating, I mean, for one, I was enraptured anyway, because dancer.
Yeah.
And so she would take me to go see dance. So I would see modern dance. I'd also go see ballet, and we'd be looking around and there'd be so many empty seats in the theater. And it's not like these things were like, tickets were so expensive that you wouldn't be able to. It was like a nice night out, and we were talking, and it sort of came down to the sort of the, like you were talking about before, of people view like classical music as like the snob music, right? And there's a similar thing happening in dance too, where it's like, oh, we're sort of above this. Whereas when I'm there, I want to be an ambassador for this stuff. I want to say like, no, you need to go and see live live performance. You need to go see dance. You need to listen to Beethoven played live by an orchestra. Like this will, this is this is the best that humanity has to offer. And I wish I was seeing more champions of that, just more people speaking out and saying like, this will change your life.
Yeah, I mean, my frustration is if you go to the opera, especially, look around. This is now we haven't been to a performance in a while because of the pandemic, but you'd look around and my wife and I would look around and we're like, we're the youngest people here, and we're not that young anymore, right?
Yeah.
And they'd have the buses. You see the buses pulling up from the nursing homes, local nursing homes. We said it's a familiar sight. It's like, oh yeah, there's the. We know the names of them now because the buses pull up and the people get out and they go into the opera or the symphony performances, and so that is sort of that sort of aging of the audience. And I think it's because there hasn't been that, like I said, the ambassadors, the people going out there and exposing people to this. The people talk about how difficult it is to understand Shakespeare because it has this Elizabethan style of language. Well, it's not that difficult. I mean, to translate thee and thou, it's it's not that difficult. It's just if you're not exposed to it, it's unfamiliar.
Right.
And I had the fortune of being exposed to this as a kid, partly in my schooling and mostly at home. Actually, we had a great local theater group that was like super hardcore. They did Shakespeare. They did Greek tragedies, but they did the Greek tragedies like in masks and with the chorus chanting in unison. And
oh wow,
I got to college and had this professor explaining, well, this is how they actually perform these things. And I'm like, well, yeah, I've seen this every summer for the last 10 years. I've seen them do this, but so it wasn't unusual to me. But so just getting exposed to that stuff and having that familiarity, especially when you're young. And I think that's something that's gotten sort of dumbed down out of the schools. Mm-hmm. I think some of the blame for that also goes to, one of my projects that I want to do at some point is called The Death of the Highbrow. Instead of charting how this happened. One of the ways it happened, I think, is that modernism came in with this whole new approach to art. And one of the things the modernists tended to do was they tended to want to sort of wipe out everything that came before them. I know my wife went to a modernist architecture school. She went to IIT, which is like Mies van der Rohe's program. So, you went there to learn how to build a glass and steel ice cube tray kind of, building. And she said architectural history education sort of begins in 1880. And you forward from that, everything before that is considered like not worth learning, right? And that sort of tends to happen. I noticed at my kids' school to some extent that sometimes the art teachers would be like, you start with Picasso and go from there, and Michelangelo and all the great art, all the great David and Michelangelo and all the great art of previous eras isn't even presented.
Oh,
and so I think modernism sort of came in, and it's in its urge to present itself as the only alternative. It sort of wiped out some of the exposure to the earlier forms of art and narrowed things down and narrowed down the appeal of art. Because I also think that I'm kind of a critic of modern art and modern dance and things like that. I'm open-minded to some of it, but a lot of it tends to be like very, it's weird and it's dissonant. And I particularly hate modern opera because, dissonance in music is bearable unless it's an operatic voice, and then it becomes utterly unbearable. It's like if you think opera is screeching, you should go to a modern opera, and that's like screeching on steroids. But so I think sometimes they sort of narrowed it down to only this sort of modern stuff is the high art, and then the average person looks at that and says, "Oh, I don't. What's this Jackson Pollock thing with a bunch of drips on the canvas? I don't get it. I'm not interested," and they move on. And so by narrowing it to we're just presenting the modern stuff, you diminish the popular appeal, and then the whole thing sort of drifts away, and we lose this amazing heritage.
Yeah, and also it's kind of it's very unfair too, because the modern artists, they're whatever they're doing is in response to the art that came before them that they studied. Right. So it's sort of like, no,
right.
These people who are doing this stuff, they got to study all the classics. They got to go to art school and to do all that. So it's sort of like the a similar thing happens when I remember seeing like some book list where it's like, here are 100 books that you really don't have to read. And it was obvious that the person who wrote this thing had read those books, had read, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. You don't have, there are other Westerns you could read. It's like, but you read that, and to tell like, especially a young kid who, doesn't have the experience just because they don't have the experience, to say, you can forget about that. Don't worry about that. Like one of sorry, go ahead.
The argument that really offends me is the idea that, well, there was some in the article I cited a librarian, a library journal, Journal of Library Science, or it's something like that, a journal for librarians, where someone was arguing that, well, I only assign books to my students that are about people who are like them, people who look like them, who are from the same background. And I'm like, well, that's the exact opposite of the point of literature and education. Is you're supposed to be broadening out, and you're supposed to learn about people who don't look like them. So if and that goes for me, that I should be reading books about people from other cultures and trying to broaden my horizons. But, the kids need Shakespeare and they need Homer and all that. So they have something that goes beyond. I mean, they know their own environment. They know the neighborhood they grow up in. They know the culture they come from. The importance of education is you broaden that out and they know everything. And I find it particularly weird with Shakespeare because, Shakespeare is like the most translated and most adapted play, author of all time. Every culture, every language. He's hugely popular in India, where they adapt him all sorts of different ways. One of my favorite Shakespeare performances I ever saw was in London, and it was a performance of Twelfth Night, but it was set in modern India. And it was really fascinating watching it, because in London, there's this large Anglo-Indian audience, right? That knows, and it was described as the Bard meets Bollywood. And so there was this whole Anglo-Indian audience. And the funniest part about it was there were moments where it's a comedic thing. So there'd be a little joke. And I'd be like, okay, that's kind of funny. And the people in the audience would be practically falling out of their chairs laughing. And I'm like, realizing that there's like a level on this joke that connects to their cultural background that I'm not getting.
Yeah.
And it made it, I think, a fascinating experience. Like, you could take Shakespeare and then put him into this other cultural context and get more out of him.
Yeah, we saw, it was back at I think it's called St. Anne's Theater in Brooklyn, and it was an all-women production of The Tempest, and it takes place in a women's prison, and it was phenomenal. It was so great, and it was one of those things where it's like, yes, exactly. You're keeping the work alive and doing it in a fresh way where I'm glued, to the scenes, and it was incredible. And it's funny you bring up Twelfth Night, because my father-in-law, his good friend, is a teacher in a middle school, and he had the idea of, it would be great if Lou, as a comedian, could speak to some eighth graders who were reading Twelfth Night. So I got to do that. I got to speak to I think maybe like 5 eighth grade classes throughout the day. The one thing that was weird was that it was over Zoom. So it was me kind of standing there speaking into the camera, and then everybody in the class had masks on. So I had the sound was bad, and I had no clue if anything I was saying was reaching them. And I had to tell them, like, look, I promise you guys, I am funny. I swear, which is a terrible thing that you could possibly say to someone. But for the most part, we didn't really discuss Twelfth Night that much. We ended up just sort of discussing my time working on Impractical Jokers, which they were all very very interested in, and I understand that. But when I was in college, I got to be in King Lear. So this was a story that I told them, and I was preparing
that well-known comedy.
Yes, hilarious. and this is how bad the production was. So no scenes were cut out, right? So I think it took us I think it was like over 3 hours, right? That we did the play.
Yeah.
We did a matinee performance one day. So we did two performances of that in one day. And I went to NYU, and rather than use one of the NYU stages, for some reason, the people who produced it, the students who produced it, booked a theater in like the theater district in Manhattan. So it was like nobody there, you know. So it was a very, very, very low attendance. We're doing King Lear, and I played the Duke of Cornwall, which I don't know if you're familiar with the play, but I have one great scene where I knock one of the other characters to the ground. He's tied to a chair, and I yell at him. I say, "Out, vile jelly! Where is thy luster now?" And I cut his eye out. And one of the bits that we did is, I think we put a grape on the end of the dagger. So after that, like, I fling it back and it like hit somebody in the audience. I mean, that was a little bit of comedy there. And then afterward, the only comment I got on my performance was someone who said, "You know, I never thought I'd hear Shakespeare in a Brooklyn accent." And
okay, you got me going here, Lou.
Yeah.
Because this is one of my crusades. Okay, so this started with me. I'm going to be total theater geek on you here. So this started when I discovered a guy named, I think his name is David Crystal, who reconstructed what's called original pronunciation. So we're used to hearing Shakespeare as, to be or not to be. That is the question, sort of.
Right.
So James, the Robert, was it
Gielgud? Is that?
Yeah, Gielgud, or Laurence Olivier kind of style of performing. Well, that's not how people spoke in Shakespeare's time. That's a 19th century accent that became the standard, to call it received pronunciation. So these guys went back there and they reconstructed as best they could original pronunciation of Shakespeare. And it's sort of this mix of like Australian and Cockney and, all these, it's basically like it's fascinating because you can see how every different English accent, accent of English across the world, how they all came out of that.
Wow.
Right? It has elements of all of them. And it's fascinating. And one of the things they discovered is that when you perform, they did this to the Globe, if you perform an original pronunciation, it's faster and the plays are shorter. So these 4-hour plays suddenly become a lot shorter. And so the thing about that is that I think that sort of set off a little bit of a revolution in British stage, where it's okay to perform Shakespeare in regional accents because they're pretty much close to the original thing. So my crusade is Shakespeare in American regional accents, right? Because we're used to, American Shakespeare is sort of the Orson Welles, two households, both alike in dignity, and fair Verona will be they are seen, that kind of thing, right? Right. It's this sort of fancy American English, right?
Right.
But why not do it in accents? So, like, for example, that's the opening of Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo and Juliet, what kind of story is Romeo and Juliet?
What's it? Star-crossed lovers.
No.
Warring. The warring.
It's a mob movie. It's a mob movie, Lou.
Yeah,
it's two Italian families in conflict with each other. So I say set it in Brooklyn, right? Two households, both alike in dignity. In fair Verona where they are seen. From old grudge break to fresh mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. Go full Brooklyn on it and do a Brooklyn Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's already been kind of done with West Side Story and that sort of thing, but we should be doing this sort of thing with Shakespeare. We should be making it vital. It's so endlessly adaptable to everything. Do it in different accents. Like, is this a dagger I see before me?
You could totally see like doing something in the Westerns. And
we've all missed out by not having Sam Elliott do Macbeth.
Oh wow. Oh man. Yeah, who would be Banquo, I wonder? That'd be awesome. You brought up David by Michelangelo, and one of the best things that ever happened to me and my wife is my good friend got married in Italy, outside of Florence. So we got to spend a few days in Florence, and I got to go see David for the first time. And I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm a little speechless just thinking back where
you see pictures and it's one of those things where it's like this is better than the pictures. It doesn't really capture it. What I was struck by was the size of him. He's a giant.
Unreal. Yeah. And it's interesting. David is a giant, where you wonder like what would if he did Goliath, what would Goliath look like? And I just found myself not wanting to leave. I didn't want to leave this presence here that was just unbelievable. And reading your pieces about the classics, I'm like, I want every kid, if possible, to be able to head over there and see for themselves uh you know what history has to offer us. And when I was in college, I got to study at the Prado in Madrid. And I mean, talk about like a kid not knowing how good he had it, just looking back and like, oh yeah, I'm going to take an art history class and then just go walk around, Caravaggio's and Velasquez's and and then think about it, 20 years later and just pine for that.
But I think the approach here in terms of today's culture is that it should be additive, right? It should be, by studying these doesn't mean you're denying or denigrating anything else. That it should be about more. Let's have more.
Right.
We have this 5,000 years. There's all 5,000 years of civilization to absorb, and all these immense and amazing achievements. All of that should be, the job, especially when you're young, it should be to download all of that into your brain and expose yourself to it, and to be able to understand it well enough to be able to come back and appreciate it. And it doesn't end when you're a student, but I think,
Right.
Being a student gives you the basis. Like I said, I'm a pianist. I'm working on a bunch of Chopin pieces right now. I find I get so much more out of them now than I did when I was younger, because there's so much emotional depth. You can't, when you're older, you get more of what Chopin was trying to say. But I rely on the fact that, I've got that foundation that I had of being a kid, taking piano lessons and listening to that kind of music, and sort of getting a basic grasp of the language of classical music that allows me then as an adult to go back and explore that in more depth and get more out of it.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that, if we take this subtractive approach where like, no, you can't study that, or you shouldn't be studying that, and it's bad to do that, it's this punitive aspect that we have to the culture war these days.
Yeah. There's absolutely no reason why, you can't read, Shakespeare and then ask your professor, hey, is there a story that, about a person that looks like me? It's like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Here, here's that story. Yeah. It's, I don't know. I don't know if it's narcissism, but just the idea that in order for you to be able to relate to a work, it has to be about somebody who, either has the same amount of melanin that you have, or comes from the same part of the country or the world. There's a reason,
same accent, etc.
Yeah, exactly. There's a reason why, like you were talking about Shakespeare, that it transcends so many so many borders. Oh no, good. Sorry.
I had a thought, but I think I got derailed a little. No, so I think that the idea is that, what I was going to say is this, which is I have a plan for how the culture war ends. And my plan is that culture wins, right? And what I mean by that is that there's always a culture war. You look at every era of history, and there's always, a sort of a mainstream culture, and there's always young, new people coming up and rising to challenge that mainstream culture. You go back to the Renaissance, there were, Michelangelo's David, for example, was done. They actually put it in this main square of Florence, facing towards Rome, as a statement of defiance towards Rome. Yeah, that Florence had, it was considered, a lot of the stuff going on in Florence at that time was considered the products of humanism versus the sort of old medieval approach of the church. So there was a culture war going on there. But the form the culture war took was, okay, you built a sculpture, I'm going to build a sculpture. You built a cathedral, I'm going to build a cathedral. You wrote a play, I'm going to write a play. And that's what the culture war should always be. It should be each person creating new work that represents their viewpoint and tries to sort of appeal to people. Like, isn't my viewpoint so amazing? Isn't this play so great? Isn't this sculpture so beautiful that you should want to be sort of brought over to my side? That's what a healthy culture war looks like, right? So culture wins. You create more and more culture with people competing to who can do the best.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it seems like it's a lot easier nowadays to tear something down than it is to put the work in and actually build something great. And on a a similar point, I in a previous episode, I spoke with a guy about the trials and tribulations of the Simpsons Apu, and how it's like, wow, they really took an amazing, really a deep character, a deep cartoon character, and just tore him down. And it's like, rather than just saying like, okay, you have that character, now we're going to make something that we think is even more special, and that'll have even more resonance with people.
Yeah, I wrote something a while back called "The Theory of Wokeness Relativity," and it was based on the fact there was somebody who they'd found some comments that Albert Einstein wrote in his personal notebooks, never shared with anybody, but some things he wrote in his personal notebooks that seemed to, he was traveling around the world, and they seemed to be somewhat culturally insensitive remarks that he made, and so we had to cancel Albert Einstein because of these things, so I came up with my own theory on this called the theory of wokeness relativity, which is that the basic equation is that the wokeness of the observer is always greater than the wokeness of the historical figure. And I actually get a little formula there, W O greater than WH. And the idea being that all you have to do, in this sort of wokeness approach, all you have to do to be greater than the greatest person who ever lived, all you have to do is to find some fault in that person that makes you superior and more enlightened. And you could have, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, helps create the first, free first nation based on individual rights. Amazing achievement, amazing advance for human liberty, but you find the things that are wrong with him, and therefore he is the bad guy, and you, who have done nothing, the average person criticizing him has done nothing to advance the cause of human liberty, but you're suddenly greater than him because you can find the things to criticize him for. And even if they're legitimate things, it's that the idea of taking it out of context, of saying that you are greater than the greatest because of your ability to criticize them and tear them down, rather than because of something better that you and greater that you have done. And I think we need to get back to that attitude. I think that the wider context for this is there's a great study done a number of years ago by some academics who talked about there are three different kinds of societies based on what it is that is taken as the basis for giving you status and value, personal sense of your own value in those societies. They said, well, there used to be honor societies. So your honor, your reputation in the eyes of others was the most important thing. So sort of think the Renaissance, think Romeo and Juliet, right? Your honor. Think the mob for that matter. And then there was a society of dignity where, Frederick Douglass could be a slave, but because he had a great mind, he still had dignity. Or somebody like Martin Luther King, right? You could be fighting against injustice. You could be attacked. You should be thrown in jail. But because of the greatness of your own interior soul, you still have dignity. And then they said that's been superseded by a society of victimhood, where being a victim is what gives you status and worth and honor in a society. So you have to constantly finding grievances and looking for microaggressions and looking for ways that you have overcome adversity and been marginalized. And that is what gives you status. And that goes against the whole idea of create something greater to show it goes towards the idea of you elevate yourself by finding fault in somebody else, rather than you elevate yourself by accomplishing something on your own. So I would say that what we need is a society, not of victimhood, but a society of achievement, where you get status and a sense of internal worth is by pointing and saying, here's this thing I made, here's this thing I created, here's this thing I did, and here's the value of that. And that's what gives you worth and status, rather than saying, oh, well, I'm a marginalized person from such and such a background, or, I went through this horrible traumatic experience, and that's what gives me value.
Yeah, and if you are, sort of in a constant state of victimhood, then it's sort of like, well, getting out of bed is an achievement. Like you just got out of bed. Oh my God, how did you even raise your head from your pillow? Like, man, this is incredible. And I spoke about this with a previous guest, where when I was younger, I was a lot more. I identified a lot more with being Latino. Like I insisted people call me Luis. Like that's my, and I was, the history of my people, whatever the fuck that meant. But then, as I got older and actually had some, personal achievement and things that I've accomplished that, you know, set me apart from, other people, and especially other people named Luis Perez, because man, the amount of like credit checks and stuff that we just bought a house. So, I mean, the rap sheet on guys named Luis Perez were like this thick. And I'm like, you guys got to get your shit together, man, because you're really, my credit
dragging it down for the rest of us.
Yeah, man, my credit score is over 800 and I don't know what you guys are up to. But now it's sort of like, now the temptation is to sort of slip back and be like, oh, well, because of my last name, I'm, a marginalized person. And, it sucks that, I think so many people are taking that route rather than saying like, here's something I made. And this is something.
And the interesting thing is that's kind of the flip side of the sort of alt-right and then white nationalist types. Because, I run across those guys because they'll talk about, oh yeah, we're defending Western civilization. And, it's like, well, their version of defending Western civilization is basically, I'm going to claim credit for all great things that white people have ever done.
Right.
In order to make up for the fact that I'm living in my mom's basement. That's very much the style of the sort of alt-right or online white nationalist types, is that they're very chest thumping about the greatness of white people while they're living in their mom's basement. And it's clear that the purpose of that is, the purpose of racism for them is to give them this automatic sense of superiority that they can get without having accomplished anything themselves.
Yeah. Anytime I've had run-ins with them online, I always say, all right, well, show me your resume. I want to see what I want to see what that looks like. I want to see what that CV looks like, what your accomplishments are. Because like my dad is an immigrant from Argentina. He didn't even graduate high school, and he's a successful businessman, right? I can't even imagine taking credit for the achievements of my father, let alone achievements of a people. It's it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah, and when people talk about privilege, I mean, I came from a sort of solid middle class background, but I've always been very conscious, because I know the history of the immediate my parents and grandparents, that I came from a solid middle class background, but my parents didn't, and my grandparents didn't. I got a grandfather who was basically a hillbilly wandering down out of the hills of Kentucky into Cincinnati 100 years ago. And so, I'm very conscious of the fact that there are people who came before me who worked and struggled and accomplished all these amazing things. And the way you honor that is to go accomplish as much as you can on that basis. They did this so that I could go out and do and accomplish those things as well.
Yeah. You describe yourself as an objectivist. Talk about a philosophy that is very much misunderstood or maligned or strawmanned often. How do you if you have to explain like what objectivism is, like how would you describe that to the uninitiated?
Right. Yeah, so I should plug. I've written a book on that a couple years ago called "So Who is John Galt Anyway?" And it's sort of a reader's guide. It's a series of essays analyzing different aspects, historical, philosophical, literary aspects of the book. And one of the persistent themes in the book is basically here's why the caricature that people have of Ayn Rand is wrong. And I'm going to go explain that by looking at the novel. Like, for example, Ayn Rand hated poor people. Well, she has all these, her novels are studded with these people who started out poor and then, worked their way up. I mean, this is a mainstay of it. And most of the villains are rich guys, in Atlas Shrugged especially. So I would describe it, though, the most interesting way to describe it is that Ayn Rand was really an inheritor of the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment. And this is the idea of confidence in reason as a way of understanding the world. And an acceptance of individualism and of self-interest as a legitimate moral idea, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? They just put it. Thomas Jefferson. There was widespread Enlightenment idea, so widespread, Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, that the purpose of life is the pursuit of happiness. So there's a sort of an acceptance of self-interest and individualism there, that you, the individual, your job is to go out and pursue your happiness, to pursue prosperity and to make your life better. And then an advocacy of a free society, an advocacy of a government that's strictly limited, and that, the rule for government should be that it's allowed to do a few tiny little things here, and the rule is the government is very tightly constricted and only allowed to do a few narrowly prescribed things. But the rule for citizens is we're not constricted. We're banned from doing a few narrowly prescribed things, and everything else is a wide open field for us to make our own decisions and make our own choices. And I think crucially, Ayn Rand's idea, she was an advocate of reason. The idea is that we should be allowed to use our own reason. We should be able to use the faculty of reason to make our decisions about how we're going to, order our personal lives, how we're going to go out and make a living, how we're going to get paid, how we're going to run our businesses. We should be allowed to use that faculty of reason in order to improve our lives. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the very simplest explanation. There's a whole, there's very technical philosophy behind it. But that's the simplest explanation. And it's this sort of attitude of your goal in life, your job in life is you come here with the faculty to think, and you should be able to use that faculty of thinking to go out and improve your life and make a better world for yourself.
How's it been working out for you?
I do okay.
You do, right?
I think of myself as a little bit like, there's one line from the Fountainhead that always comes with me, which is that, when Howard Rourke, the hero of the Fountainhead, is asked what he wants to do, he says, I want to do my work my way. And, talk about, he goes through periods of struggle and poverty and, loses jobs and things like that because he's trying to do that. But that's how he gauges his happiness is, am I able to do the work I want to do? And so, I make a lot more money if we're out there doing the sort of the grifter thing that we see these days of, the sort of Sean Hannity, tell people what they want to hear, find a partisan bone to chew and go chew on it like a bulldog. There's a lot of ways to make money on that. But the success that I choose, the standard I choose for my success is I get to wake up every morning and say, okay, I've got a really interesting article I want to write. Or I saw this thing, this really interesting article somebody else wrote. I want to recommend that to my subscribers on my newsletter. Or here's a guy has something interesting to say. I'm going to commission him to write an article on, for my magazine. So the idea of being able to just wake up every morning and decide I've got something to say, I've got things that I find are interesting, I've got the work that I really want to do that makes me excited and interested, and I get to do that every morning. And if I get to do that, and I don't have to go, sell insurance in New Jersey, then I consider that to be a tremendous success.
Yeah, right on. Well,
no offense to people who live in New Jersey or sell insurance.
Hey, man, I bought some insurance in New Jersey, and so far I'm very happy with it. What you were talking about, I want to do my work my way. I wonder if I think I might recommend this to objectivists is start quoting Sinatra. I did it my way.
Did it my way.
It seems
one
like
of my favorite songs, by the way.
Yeah. How do you, where does like someone like Sinatra fit in, with classical and all that?
Well, I think, like I said, it's additive. It's not exclusive. It's
right.
Like I listen to classical music. I grew up on rock and roll, so I've got my favorites. The 80s was a good era, actually, if you ask me. But I have a line I always get to my wife, which is, our music was so much better than that noise the kids are listening to these days. And, that's every generation says that, right? Our music was so much better that I don't get what the young kids are listening to. And that's a natural process that the popular music of your era has certain associations. So I'm not going to say the music of the 80s was better than everything else objectively, but I grew up on it, so it means something to me. Yeah. But and I'm a huge Sinatra fan. So and I've in another life, if I had more time, I would do a classical music podcast. I may get around to it eventually. But one of the things I want to talk about in that is the difference between classical music and popular music. And the short answer is classical music is different in that it's more complex, but there's been huge interplay between the two of them through all of history. You have all these great classical music songs that are based on a tune that the composer's walking along and he hears some shepherd, humming a folk tune. And he says, "Oh, that's good. Let me use that." And then he goes and develops it and makes it more complicated and, varies it and adds all sorts of complexity to it to make it into classical music. But there's been an interplay between the two for as long as there has been music.
Yeah. Well, if you ever get
I think the whole approach is.
Yeah. I was just going to say, if you ever get to do that podcast, please do it with the piano, because I think that. I absolutely love. I'm not a musician. I love when musicians are able to break down what's going on under beneath their fingers. I recently watched a Dick Cavett interview with Paul Simon. So obviously it was from late 60s or early 70s, and Paul Simon describing how he came up with Mrs. Robinson, and how he was working on a song that I think would later become like Bridge Over Troubled Water, and I think he was stealing from some classical composer and all that. It was super interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. If I do it, I'm an amateur pianist, so I'm not. There are limits to my skill, but I actually am a bit of a champion too of that sort of amateur performance. I think too many people, they take piano lessons in school, when they're kids, and they get to a certain point where, there's the weeding out that happens when you're out 16, 17, 18, where you're either going to go on to do this professionally or you're not. And if you're not, they tend to drop it. And I did that for about 20 years. And then my first son was born, and I decided I don't want my kids growing up thinking, music comes out of this little metal box that you have in your pocket. I want them to know that it actually comes from an instrument and you can play it. So I got a piano and got back into it. And I'm a big champion of the idea of amateur performance of music, because it puts you in touch with the music in a way that just listening to it on the radio or listening to it on your iPod or whatever doesn't do.
Right on. I have a couple of guitars that are full of dust in guitar cases. I almost call them that they're in coffins. I need to dig them up, and hopefully I'll get to play again one day. Robert, thank you so much. For those of you looking to check out Robert's stuff, check out Symposium as well as the Tracinski letter. I'm going to take that back. For those of you looking to check out Robert's stuff, check out Symposium as well as the Tracinski letter. Thank you so much for watching and or listening to my podcast. If you'd like to support my work, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community. And another way to support me is by supporting my sponsors. Black Organic Cold Brew. Head over to www.blvckbrew.com. Use promo code LOU for free shipping. And if you're into CBD products, please check out palomaverdecbd.com. Use promo code LOU for 25% off purchases over $75. All right. Bye.